everyone. Welcome to the Futurevia Podcast. And today we have a special speaker, Canadian Minister Ed Fast. And a pleasure to have you here.
Good to be on your show.
Okay, so I guess as a way of introduction and talking about Ukraine, so reflecting at your time as a minister, how would you characterize Canada's historical relationship with Ukraine?
I would say over the years, it hasn't been as close as it could have been. We have a very significant Ukrainian diaspora within Canada, which has been very active in promoting Ukraine's interests. It has also spawned many, many different political leaders, business leaders. So the Ukrainian community is well embedded in Canada and our corporate culture, our social culture. When I was Minister of Trade for Canada between 2011 and 2015, it was also during that period of time that Vladimir Putin decided to invade Crimea. And when that happened, we realized that Ukraine was in a really tough spot. And because Canada had been very active in negotiating trade agreements all around the world, I decided to instruct my officials to move ahead and pursue the possibility of a trade agreement with Ukraine. In fact, that materialized. And it was the first free trade agreement Canada had ever signed that was asymmetrical. By that, I mean the outcomes were weighted heavily in favor of Ukraine, in that new market access for each of the parties was accelerated for Ukraine and was delayed for Canada to allow Ukraine to immediately get a leg up, a hand up, so that Ukraine would have another tool to drive economic growth and to restore what was already a floundering economy.
Yeah, amazing. That's great. Thank you for doing that. And I was wondering, how has your political perspective on Ukraine shifted since Russian 2014 annexation of Crimea?
Well, you should know that my family's roots are actually in Ukraine. I'm from a Russian Mennonite background, and many of our Mennonites actually lived around the Zaporozhye region and look back fondly on the good years that they had in Ukraine. Of course, under Stalin, everything changed, and the Mennonites were persecuted, as were many other religious and other minorities. And so I look back on my family's history and say, my goodness, for about 150 years, we were sheltered, we were prosperous in the region, and then the Soviets came along. Not Vladimir Putin. Firstly, would have been Lenin and Marx, and then, of course, you would have had the dictator Stalin, and then Vladimir Putin. And it has very much reinforced my commitment to supporting Ukraine. I think your question is directed at just generally in Canada, are Canadians supportive of Ukraine? Is support for Ukraine waning like it is in some quarters of the United States? And I can tell you with absolute certainty, it is not. In Canada, we are fully committed to doing what we can to support Ukraine during this existential crisis that it faces.
Yeah, and speaking on Canada's foreign policy related to that, what are some key milestones do you believe Canada has achieved in supporting Ukraine since the war began in 2022, like the full-scale invasion?
Actually, the most significant one would have been approximately a year ago when Canada and and Ukraine actually finalized the negotiation of a renewed and updated free trade agreement. This was something that was very important for Ukraine because, as you know, the trade front has been changing dramatically. And having had a few years of experience with the original trade agreement that I helped negotiate, the current government was able to say, hey, there are areas of improvement for both sides. Why don't we have a look at updating it? And that's actually what happened. Of course, Canada has also been supporting Ukraine's military along the way. We've been sending them a lot of equipment, including tanks. Now, Canada is not the United States. We don't have the most sophisticated weaponry because we just don't have the scope and size. But we do what we can to help Ukraine push back against Russian aggression.
That's amazing. And like speaking about Canada's global effectiveness and global like perspective, how would you assess like Canada's diplomatic approach within NATO and G7 when it comes to coordinating support for Ukraine?
Well, we have one vulnerability in Canada, and that is we have not lived up to our NATO commitment of spending 2% of our GDP on defense spending. In fact, we're probably at 1.3, 1.4%. So we're way below the target that all of us agreed to meet. And it's a major failing on our part. And I'm the first to acknowledge that. I believe going forward, there's a commitment from the two main parties, political parties in Canada, to actually move and hit that 2% target. Now, you will have noticed that Donald Trump has actually mused about increasing that target to 5%. And of course, the consequence is in the hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. And that would be a very tough one to stomach. But the 2% target is eminently doable for Canada. And it would enable us to do much more for Ukraine, because I believe it's Ukraine now that is the number one focus of Canada's military support around the world.
Yeah, that's amazing. And like, so speaking about like trade and assuming like Ukraine wins and some kind of like beneficial agreement is reached for Ukraine, hopefully in the near future. So as like a former Minister of International Trade, what opportunities do you see for post-war Canadian-Ukraine economic cooperation?
Well, I believe that Ukraine's and Canada's economies are very, very different. Because Canada is a fully developed country, highly educated, has had significant prosperity for a long time. We have developed industries and are very good at doing things that Ukraine is not yet capable of doing, or maybe capable of doing, but hasn't actually reached that milestone. Ukraine is good at doing other things, and that's the beauty of free trade, because I'm a big champion of free trade. There's two views of free trade. One is that it's a zero-sum game in which you have one winner and you have a loser, and you cannot have mutual gain within free trade. The other one is based on comparative advantage, which is, listen, every country specializes in certain modes of production that are suited to their populace, to their economy. And when trade is fair and free, you maximize that comparative advantage to raise the prosperity in both countries. And that's what I see here between Canada and Ukraine, is that because our economies are so different and the challenges facing our economies are so different, we have the ability to harness that comparative advantage to deliver enhanced prosperity for both countries. In my view, I think the number one focus should be enhancing prosperity in Ukraine, and actually in enhancing prosperity around the world in some of the poorer countries through free trade, because when you improve the prosperity of the world, you improve the prosperity and security of the United States, Canada, and the rest of the developed world.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one of the things a lot of people don't know is that actually green energy companies and the green energy sector was developing pretty rapidly in the recent years. And was wondering, how do you see like Canada's role in facilitating this green energy transition in Ukraine and less reliance on like natural gas and like all those.
Well, what I would inject here is a note of caution. I think Germany is the perfect example of how not to do an energy and a green transition. By the way, I'm a big fan of Angela Merkel. She was a great chancellor. I believe she was one of the world's leaders that was truly a servant leader and had the temperament and the thoughtfulness to govern well. But she made a few mistakes, two key ones, and one of those was effectively fumbling the energy transition that was supposed to move Germany from fossil fuel based energy to renewables. And I don't believe they were realistic enough about what it would take to do that and the devastation that would inflict upon their economy. So that would be my note of caution, is that, you know, Germany has had to reconsider how it did that transition. And the irony is, you know, they had then had to buy electricity from places like France, which actually has nuclear energy, which is clean, but had been shut down in Germany. Coal-fired energy had been shut down in Germany. And now the country is struggling to find the energy to power its number one economy in the European Union. So can Canada and Ukraine collaborate and cooperate on moving towards a greener economy? Absolutely. Of course, Canada has some great companies doing business in that space. We have some amazing technology. But you mentioned natural gas, Alexander. Natural gas is a fossil fuel. But the way that Canada extracts, produces natural gas is very different from how it's produced elsewhere around the world, like places in Nigeria or, say, Saudi Arabia or Russia. We do it in a very highly technological and what I would call, at this point in time, environmentally sustainable way. Our carbon footprint is much, much lower than it would be in other producers around the world. So I would say that Canada should become the preferred producer of natural gas to power the economies of countries around the world that are looking to transition or should be transitioning. Even China, you know, we in Canada, we're actually not that far away from China because, you know, we can ship right from our west coast, and we've just finished building a new LNG terminal on our west coast, just north of where I live. And we can get that natural gas to China very quickly and allow them to convert their energy production to a much cleaner form of energy, and thereby reduce global GHG emissions. So I don't want to disparage natural gas as a way of moving towards a greener economy. I think it's a transitional measure. And I believe one day we will actually arrive at a place where technology will have found a way of actually burning natural gas and conventional oil and be able to do it and capture all of the carbon that's emitted. I believe that technology will be there someday. As you know, carbon capture is a very significant technology that Canada is one of the world leaders in. There's a company just north of where I am that is a very innovative company that is actually capturing carbon and carbon dioxide out of the air itself. And that research is going on all around the world. And I believe one day we'll be able to live in a world where there are no carbon emissions happening, certainly in the developed world, and then eventually, I think, in the rest of the world.
Yeah, that would be great. And speaking on the energy sector, I mean, it's one of the major issues in Ukraine is the presence of oligarchy. And obviously, they dominate like some of these sectors, such as energy and other sectors like the media. So, how do you see like post-war, what steps should Ukraine take, and how can Canada help with that to kind of like step away from oligarchy and allow for a more freer and more market that would allow for more like foreign direct investments and
I think you'll have to wait until the war has been completed and a resolution has been agreed upon. You need peace in the country to reestablish the kind of democratic institutions that are going to rein in the excesses of the oligarchs. Now, I don't know Ukraine well enough to be able to speak with great precision on what should happen in Ukraine to restrain the influence of the oligarchs. But I can tell you from my experience elsewhere around the world, for example, we've negotiated trade agreements with countries like Peru and Colombia. Both of those countries were coming out of very troubled pasts with terrorism, domestic terrorism, with security issues that we can't even imagine. And Canada chose to negotiate free trade agreements with both those countries. And what that process then opened up for us as Canadians was the ability to then speak into some of the democracy building challenges that each of those countries faced. For example, how do you build a stronger court system and a justice system? How do you enhance police protection? How do you make the rule of law more robust? How do you move towards a sustainable economy that is balanced, that's based on market principles, that doesn't flounder, from year to year and from decade to decade? And I have found that if you engage in improving the prosperity of a trading partner, you then have open doors to speak into other elements of their democracy. And I would hope that could happen between Canada and Ukraine, because we have this relationship anyways through our diaspora in Canada that is just so desperate to help out and are so supportive of pushing back on Russian aggression in Ukraine. And so I have great hope for the future of Ukraine. If peace can be established, a lasting peace with the security assurances that are required to maintain that peace, I think Ukraine is going to bounce back, because there are so many millions. Well, let's say, yeah, there are probably millions of Ukrainians abroad that would love to move back to Ukraine and help to regrow the economy and re-establish Ukraine as a thriving democracy. And that's the hope that I share.
how do you see how do you foresee that peace establishing? Like how would you assess like the current administration in Ukraine? Are they taking the right steps towards that peace? How do you see that happening?
I have been very reluctant to inject myself into how the leaders of countries that are under attack respond. Same is true in the Middle East as well. I have not injected myself. I do believe that Israel needs to have the right to respond in a way that serves their security interests. And the same is true in Ukraine as well. I'm not going to tell the president of Ukraine how he should be conducting the war effort. I am confident that with the right, with good faith, on both sides. And that's going to be a challenge on the Russian side because I'm not sure you can ever take their word for anything. But it will require American involvement, obviously, and a very firm establishment of red lines that will secure the long-term security of Ukraine, which both of us obviously want to see happen.
And do you foresee Ukraine being a part of NATO and EU in the future?
Personally, yes, I would like to see Ukraine be part of both of those organizations. Obviously, if they're part of NATO, that would be by far the most significant assurance we could provide to Ukraine and its security. And that would involve Canada, of course. If they're a member of NATO, Canada is a member of NATO. Now we're partners in security and defense. That would be, I believe, the optimal outcome. Whether that happens, I don't know. I'm not sure the Trump administration is necessarily supportive of that.
And how would you how can Canada help Ukraine reduce dependency on aid since humanitarian aid has been very beneficial to Ukraine these last few years, and how can Ukraine become a self-sufficient economy after the war?
Well, what I would say is this. I do believe Ukraine is going to require international help for years to come. The devastation in Ukraine is hard to imagine. There is a discussion happening in Canada and in other like-minded countries about taking the proceeds of the seized assets and not allowing them to be returned to Russia at all, but to be used exclusively for the rebuilding of Ukraine. If there can be a multilateral effort with like-minded countries to actually implement that kind of a policy, that would be a huge win, because Canada, not unlike many of our partners, has seized significant assets from Russia and the Russian oligarchs. And if the proceeds of those seized assets were converted towards aid in supporting the rebuilding of Ukraine, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars available to achieve that outcome. And so I think that is a great opportunity then to also rebuild the economy. You're not only rebuilding infrastructure and, say, housing, you're also rebuilding the ability of Ukraine now to eventually become self-sufficient. I don't think anyone, including Ukrainians, want to remain dependent on the rest of the world. They want to have economic independence, to have a robust economy that they can rely on. And that's why I'm also going to encourage other countries to do what they can to negotiate trade agreements with Ukraine that open up new trade opportunities for Ukrainian entrepreneurs.
Yeah, absolutely. And some experts estimate that Ukraine economy has been uh, impacted by over $1 trillion because a lot of the industries are down, a lot of the companies aren't producing as much as they would have produced. So definitely Ukraine needs a lot of international support to help rebuild. And I was wondering, speaking on that, so some people say that Ukraine is the turning point in global politics. So how do you see that claim?
I don't know if I would characterize Ukraine as being the turning point. Um, there are so many challenges around the world today that you could name any one. What's happening in the Middle East could be called a turning point. The emergence of Donald Trump 1.0 and 2.0 clearly could be seen as a major turning point in human history. I lament the retreat from liberalized trade and from the global rules-based order that the US has embarked upon under the Trump administration. Because it used to be that the US was the leader. It was the moral leader in the world, it was the economic leader, and it was clearly the military superpower in the world. I think it can still claim that it's the military superpower, but its influence in those other spheres is waning. And that should be great cause for concern for the global community. And so again, I say that could be seen as a major turning point as well. But having said that, that is not in any way a comment on what the world should be doing with respect to Ukraine. I believe what has happened in Ukraine should send a very clear message to the world that there are powerful nations in the world that do not respect international boundaries, that do not respect the rule of law, that are profoundly expansionist. And if they can get away with it, they will continue to expand. So powers like China and Russia, if they were allowed to, they would continue to acquire more and more and more. And so Ukraine, in that sense, is clearly a turning point for the world. We do need to push back on this, make it very clear that if we are to have a peaceful and prosperous and secure world, we cannot allow this to happen.
And how do you view the Russia's and China's increasing cooperation, especially with the rise of China as a global superpower?
Well, there is clearly a reorientation of global power, of geopolitical security alliances and economic alliances. They are troubling because bit by bit, America is being isolated. It used to be the world looked to the United States for leadership. They could trust the United States to be that leader. And the current administration is, I think it's fair to say, is isolationist. It is a protectionist administration that is turned inward. Now, I'm sure they have justifications for doing that. They believe that they can return American prosperity, when in fact, I would suggest that America remains very prosperous, more prosperous, by the way, than Canada. Our GDP per capita and GDP in absolute numbers used to be pretty well on par with the United States. We have fallen far, far behind in Canada because we actually don't have an economic growth agenda. And so growth is stagnating here, whereas in the United States, it is still pretty robust. So the suggestion that somehow the United States and its prosperity have fallen way behind and you need to return to the days of the past, there might be a grain of truth to that, but it's definitely not the whole story. And yet it's being used as a pretext to move forward with isolationism and protectionism and abandoning the rules-based global order. And so that should be of concern to all of us.
Yeah, for sure. And so like speaking about that as we're coming to an end, like what gives you hope about Ukraine's future and what message do you want to kind of like share with Ukrainians like watching this?
What gives me hope is the indomitable spirit of the Ukrainian people. What gives me hope is history, because when you look at history, history is replete with examples of larger countries, more powerful neighbors, imposing their will on the weaker. And that will continue to happen. It's just human nature. People who come into positions of power want to expand that power. The maxim "power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely" is apropos in this case, where Vladimir Putin has absolute power and wants to expand that absolute power around the world. And that's why it's important that we push back. But it also gives me hope when I look to history that eventually all leaders either have to leave or are brought to their knees. Going back thousands of years, history teaches us that. And typically, when they're brought to their knees, it's because of pride, arrogance, and hubris. And you see that in leaders like Vladimir Putin and others around the world. And eventually, that leads to their downfall, which should give us hope that the Ukrainian people have sacrificed so much. It's unbelievable what they've sacrificed. And in some respects, they've been abandoned by the United States. And I hope there is a reversal of that approach. But you know that there are many countries around the world that are supportive of Ukraine, Canada being one. And I'm hoping that at the end of the day, we'll be able to restore Ukraine as a fully independent and secure member, hopefully, of NATO and the EU.